Greetings, Ken Woodward here. Welcome back to another episode of Curated Questions. Together, we engage inquisitive humans about how they use questions to navigate and make sense of our world. I am a fellow traveler and pilgrim on this journey, and I'm glad you're here. Every one of us carries an insight we're afraid to face. Some reveal themselves quietly, others split your world down the middle. The names were everywhere. Yavapai County, Indian Head Mountain, Hopi Kachina dolls standing guard in bank lobbies. As a youth, I collected pottery shards from my central Arizona backyard without asking whose hands had shaped them. The truth was hiding in plain sight, waiting for me to develop the eyes to see it. I didn't know it at the time, but those names and those pottery shards were the first cracks in a story I thought I understood. Years later, they would become the doorway into a much larger insight, one that demanded not just information, but transformation. Most of us have cracks like that, small moments that don't fit the story we've been living inside. We feel them long before we understand them. What question are you avoiding that would change everything? Well, today on Curated Questions, we're exploring a 5-step framework for what to do when a truth forces you to rebuild the story that you've been living inside, with special focus on step 3, the insight pause, that deliberate choice to sit with destabilizing truth before rushing to resolution. So by way of introduction, today's journey, how years of unconscious preparation led to a moment that shattered my worldview. This construct is primarily instructional for life-altering insights that shift our worldviews. Why this matters? Well, we're all walking past our own version of those indigenous names. So I grew up in Prescott, Arizona, where we learned about manifest destiny and our proud role supporting the expansion of the frontier westward. You know, the Pilgrims, Thanksgiving, the Revolution. That was my American history. The pottery shards I collected, just artifacts. The tribal names everywhere, just labels on a map. Then, the Navy sent me to Groton, Connecticut. Suddenly, I was driving over the Quinnipiac River, eating fried clams in Niantic, and navigating home by Montauk Point. The Mashantucket Pequot and Mohegan casinos glittered above the Connecticut trees. Something wasn't adding up. Where were all these tribes in my manifest destiny education? But I didn't have the tools to connect the dots. Not yet. Nearly 2 decades later, driving north on I-95 surrounded by a fortress of tightly packed trees, I reflected on how difficult it must have been for the Pilgrims to get a foothold on this new continent. Then, in 2019, while I was seeking to understand what I had been missing, I picked up An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. What I found shattered everything. Page after page revealed a different story. Seeking to shore up my crumbling certainty, I turned to the Amazon 1-star reviews. I wasn't reading the reviews for information. I was reading them like a lifeline, hoping someone would give me permission to dismiss the truth. One reviewer claimed the book was full of half-truths. While I trust the book to be valid, I sat back and considered how to handle what I had learned. I thought to myself, even if 50% of the book was false, what do I do with the 50% that's true? That was the moment. The insight hurt, and I wouldn't look away. American exceptionalism was a myth. What happened next taught me everything about how transformation actually works. Step 1, a foundation. It's building comfort tolerance and recognition skills. Insight begins long before we recognize it. Life is always preparing us for the truths we're not yet ready to face. Looking back, I see how life had been preparing me for this moment without my knowing. My unconscious foundational building included living life, picking up the nuggets of wisdom to build a desired life. Navy submarine operations taught me how to learn to trust instruments and data over assumptions. Federal acquisition work was 20 years of studying technical requirements and questioning vendor claims. 9 years of Connecticut drives prompted years of cognitive dissonance I couldn't name. And those pottery shards of my youth meant daily handling of evidence I saw but didn't understand. As I reflect, I notice these three key elements. Comfort tolerance was built through repeated exposure to small contradictions that alone were not recognizable as noteworthy flags. Recognition skills, developed in one area, waiting to transfer to another. Dormant questions, living with something doesn't add up, but unwilling to invest effort to investigate. Yeah, we will revisit this point. So for listeners, I'd ask, what questions float at the edge of your consciousness? What contradictions do you live with daily? Step 2, the insight, the moment of recognition. So insight is the instant when scattered contradictions suddenly align and reveal a fully formed truth that can't be unseen. So for me, my recognition moment was sitting with that reviewer's comment, half-truths. Time seemed to stop. Even if only 50% was true, it meant millions of Indigenous people were here when pilgrims arrived. Those forests I imagine as impenetrable had well-worn paths. The pottery shards in my childhood yard weren't artifacts, they were evidence. The insight wasn't in the book. It was recognizing I couldn't unknow that American exceptionalism was built on mythology. The recognition markers were a physical sensation, chest tightening, breath catching, mental clarity, the snap of multiple puzzle pieces suddenly connecting. Knowing you can turn away, but you've already seen. Step 3, the pause. Creating sacred uncertainty space. The insight pause is choosing not to flee or fix, but to hold the destabilizing truth long enough for it to take root. This is where I stumbled into what became my practice. I set the book aside. No Google searches for counter-arguments, no phone calls seeking reassurance, no journaling to process. I just held it. Let these truths settle into my bones. When the pilgrims landed, millions of Indigenous people had thrived here for millennia. Smallpox-infested blankets were traded with intent to kill. Bison herds of 30 to 60 million were reduced to less than 1,000. Treaties were written knowing they would be ignored. These weren't abstract facts. They were implications I had never allowed myself to feel. I needed this seedling of truth to grow strong enough to withstand the hurricane that would come when I examined the implications. The pause isn't meditation or contemplation. It's holding space for a truth that unmakes your world without rushing to build a new one. It's sitting in the rubble of your shattered worldview before clearing a single stone. Step 4, integration. Processing implications when ready. Integration is the slow, honest work of letting the implications of the insight reshape your inner architecture. Weeks later, when the initial shock had settled, I began the actual work, and my integration season included returning to the book, reading with new eyes, connecting dots, current tribal poverty to historical genocide, examining every story I'd held as sacred, grieving the loss of heroes who all had clay feet, mapping what else must be questioned if this was false. So the ripple effect was, if I had been lied to about this, what else? And this framework didn't just apply to national history, it applied to my own family history. My father's hidden daughter, another truth waiting to shatter me, my faith, my politics, my identity as a good person in a good country, each revelation required its own pause. And this brings me to something crucial. Every expansion of consciousness requires allowing our heroes to have clay feet. My father, who took my half-sister's existence to the grave, the founding fathers I'd revered and walked among their marble monuments in D.C., the country I'd served in uniform. Growth demands we see the full picture, not to become cynical, but to develop a mature love that sees clearly and chooses consciously. Step 5. Liberation. New identity and the worldview emerges. Liberation is living from the clarity the insight created, no longer bound by the old story, but not severed from it either. Here's the paradox of liberation. You're free from the old worldview, but you're not free from the past. You're free to see it clearly. You don't forget where you came from. You understand why you needed to leave. To be clear, my story isn't unique. Many Americans discover these buried histories late in life, but the lateness doesn't excuse us from learning. So what emerged? Now I drive past those Indigenous names differently. They're grave markers and invitations. Evidence of genocide and resilience. I can love my country and grieve its sins. Honor my younger self and choose differently now. The pottery shards I collected all those years ago, I see them now for what they've always were. Evidence of a thriving civilization I was taught to unsee. Each piece an ever-present offering of insight I wasn't ready to take. So, let's do a deep dive on the insight pause itself. So why my pause mattered? Without that pause, I had two obvious options, both destructive. Option 1, slam the door. Dismiss the book as liberal propaganda. Find sources to confirm my bias. Double down on American exceptionalism. Live with increasing defensiveness. Option 2, reactive overcorrection. Immediately post angry social media rants. Cut off anyone who disagreed. Swing to the opposite extreme. Build new, brittle beliefs. The pause gave me a third option, transformation. And here's what's actually happening in our brains during this discomfort. Your anterior cingulate cortex is detecting the mismatch between your worldview and the new information. This is why you feel disoriented. Your brain is demanding resolution that your soul isn't ready to give. Most people try to silence it, but the discipline of the pause teaches you to listen to it instead. You're training your brain that uncertainty won't kill you, that you can hold contradictory truths without immediate resolution. The physical reality of the pause, and let me be clear about what this all felt like. Actual nausea as my worldview dissolved. Sleepless nights with no resolution available. Watching others live their certainty while I floated. The loneliness of being between worlds. This isn't comfortable. It's not meant to be. So what the pause taught me is that sacred uncertainty I learned. Truth can coexist with discomfort. Identity doesn't break, it stretches. Questions are more powerful than answers. The pause itself is the teacher. Remember those dormant questions I mentioned? They're actually the foundation's way of preparing us. Each unanswered, something is off here, is like a small crack in our certainty, weakening the structure just enough so that when the significant insight comes, we don't completely shatter, we transform. Every subsequent revelation, my father's lies, faith deconstruction, political awakening, I had a practice. I knew how to pause. Let's look at some practical applications. So this is kind of like finding your own Indigenous name story. What truths are hiding in plain sight in your life? Common hidden in plain sight truths at the workplace. Why do our best people keep leaving? Relationships. Why do I keep having the same fight? Identity. Why does this success feel empty? Beliefs. Why does this certainty require so much defending? And building your new foundations. Notice what makes you defensive. That's where insight awaits. Practice with small contradictions before big ones arrive. Develop comfort with, "I don't know," as a complete sentence. Ask, "Am I working hard not to see?" So creating your own pause practice, well, start where you are. You don't need a book about genocide to practice. Start with feedback that stung but might be true. A pattern you've been explaining away. Success that came at hidden cost. Certainty that requires constant maintenance. I call it the 48-hour rule. When insight hits, give it 48 hours before acting. One caution. Don't confuse the insight pause with procrastination or avoidance. Passive ignoring avoids truth. Active holding makes space for it. You'll know the difference by the discomfort. The real pause may pinch or even sting. Pay attention to the body wisdom. Where do you feel the truth in your body? Chest, throat, gut? Stay there. Don't analyze it. Don't name it. Just notice it. The body often knows before the mind can actually articulate. This physical awareness becomes your anchor during the storm of transformation. And then question holding. Write it, live it, and don't answer it yet. So I come with an invitation, your ever-present offering. Those Indigenous names I drove past for decades were patient teachers, waiting for their student to be ready. Your life is full of such teachers. The feedback you deflect, the patterns you rationalize, the questions you don't ask, the pesky seedlings of doubt your avoidance keeps watering, the cost you won't calculate. They're not going anywhere. They'll wait. And every expansion requires this journey. Foundation builds through living life, whether you know it or not. Insights arrived fully formed. The pause determines transformation or tragedy. Integration can't be rushed, and liberation exceeds what you've imagined. The question isn't if you'll face foundation-shaking truth, it's whether you'll have a practice when you do. An important note for our current tumultuous days. It seems everything is in flux. Things once settled are no more. There will be people around you who are in this process and are resisting, clinging to the legends and heroes they have defended, and maybe even fought you about. This is an opportunity to exercise curiosity and care as their world shifts beneath them, and they embrace their newfound liberation. Lean in and listen closely. We need each other during these pauses, not to fix or rush each other through, but to witness and hold space for the sacred uncertainty. Now, the framework is a life practice. Your questions, and I'd leave you with these. What names are you driving past? What pottery shards are you collecting without asking whose hands shaped them? What half-truths would change everything if you faced the true half? What seedling of truth needs protection in your sacred uncertainty? And then, when you're ready, what question are you avoiding that would change everything? The Indigenous names are still there. Quinnipiac, Narragansett, Yavapai. Now I see them as they are. Grave markers and birth announcements. Evidence of destruction and seeds of resurrection. Truths that waited decades for me to pause long enough to see. Your truths are waiting too. In plain sight. Patient as stones. Truth waits for your readiness, not your permission. This journey is the reason I open every episode as a pilgrim. I have used the insight pause many times as I have learned more about myself and the world around us. And for all the upheaval I've experienced and certainty I have in my current worldview, I know I have future appointments with the insight pause. Thank you for joining me in exploring this framework. If something here resonated, if you felt that tightness in your chest that signals recognition, honor it. Give it the pause it deserves. Sometimes the most profound action is deliberate inaction, the sacred pause that transforms information into wisdom. This is the hard work of being fully human in all of its nuance. Thank you for joining me. Drop in the comments section of your favorite podcast player the moments that will stick with you. To those on the other side of the speaker, thank you for being here. Gratitude shout out to Beauty Pill for the show's music and producer Ben Ford for the technical help. This episode was recorded on Piscataway land. Please engage with this episode in some manner. Download, follow, save, like, share, or comment about something that resonated. This action ensures we are engaging the questioning community. So until next time, keep questioning.